Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So what today's talk is going to be about is the dollar resource inside of Angular, what it's used for, and how it's being used. So Angular did a good job, as most applications do, is, for a successful web application, you usually have to have web services that are serving data for a single page application. And so Angular has done this with what they call the dollar HTTP. And so the dollar HTTP here is the definition. And so you give it a method, that'd be a get, post, put, or delete, or one of the other methods that is not quite standard, a URL, and some parameters for the query string, and maybe some data that you put in the data body, and then it will send the request for you, and then you get back a response inside of a promise, and then you can actually do something with that data. So this is kind of the default way of handling data communication back and forth between your web app and some data services. Now, the Angular team also decided to add another way of fetching data from the back end, and it's called dollar resource. And what dollar resource is a way to create interactions for RESTful server-side applications. Now, one of the things about this dollar resource is it does just wrap dollar HTTP, so it's not anything special, and it's not using something unique that the dollar HTTP is not using. It is actually a wrapper around dollar HTTP. But the thing that makes dollar resource a little bit different is the first thing is that it actually returns a resource object back to you, a dollar resource. And so what that gives you the ability to do is go grab data from the back end. The data that returns back is wrapped inside of a new resource object, and you can immediately then call back in calls on that resource object. And we'll show some examples here in a minute. The other thing it's done is it's giving you a few default methods to start off with. So it gives you a get, save, and delete. It doesn't have a put, but it does have probably the three most common is get, delete, and post. Now, one of the things is in RESTful calls, you have two types of gets. You have a get that is actually getting an object. That's normally what you'll see like here with a user and user ID. And that is just a plain get. If you know that you're getting back more than just one object and you're getting back an array, you should actually use a query, because that is expecting an array of objects. And even with HTTP, you'll find a lot of times you get back an error message saying that you're expecting an array and only got back an object. So, if you know you're getting back array, use query. If you know you're getting back just a single object, use get. And then you also have the save here. And so those are the two main things that dollar resource has that extends the HTTP calls that you have. So let's look at some examples, because looking at code on this is a lot easier. So the first thing I did was I have created a Node RESTful service for users, and you'll see here that I have a get, a post, a put, and a delete, and another get, which is all my users. And these have the parameter of ID, so I can get an individual user, or I can get update an individual user, or I can add a user, or I can delete a user. Okay. The reason why I'm using Node in this RESTful service is mainly because it's a little bit easier for me to show how some of this is working, rather than creating .NET objects and having .NET hide all of the plumbing that happens with creating a RESTful service. My get all users here actually also has two parameters it's looking for in the query string, a limit and a start. And this is going to go with the pagination example that I'm going to show on the second half of this. So that's my server-side code. Very simple. There's nothing real unique or special about it. It's just getting user objects from the database and sending it back to the front end. So let's look at the front end stuff that we have. So I have in here a service called user factory. You can see here at the very top here, I created a user resource object. And this object has my URL. And so my URL is a REST call, the object that I want to get, which is user, and then this :_ID. And what that means is that if I have an ID, then I will put it there. If I don't, then I will not put it there. The next line is parameters, default parameters that you may have with your resource. This particular one says that I will have a default of ID, _ID. And then since it's a JSON object, it has a value. If I put in an actual value there, like 123, then that means on every single call for my user resource, it will say rest/user/123. The @ before the value there, what that tells the user resource is look on my query, and if I find on the top level a _ID, use that as my parameter for the _ID here at this spot. Now let me make this a tad bit bigger here for you guys. Okay, so that's my user resource. And so let's look at the controller here. And at the bottom, all I'm doing is doing initialization. And here's my initialization method or function. The first thing I'm doing is I'm setting a couple of default scope items. This is for ordering on my table, so I can order by any of the columns and do reverse and forward reverse ordering. And you see here the next piece is I call user factory, get all users, and then I execute the promise then on the next line. And all I'm doing is I'm grabbing the data and I'm pushing the data into the user scope. And so inside the scope I have users, and I'm actually just using it and I'm going to iterate over it. If we look at the page real quick, this top part here is nothing but the header, and then this is my actual body that I'm going to display all these users. And so what you see here is I have users, which is where I put my data into the scope, is users, and then I'm repeating over it, creating a new user object on the individual repeat scopes and displaying all the information. And then here I have a edit and delete row, and those call two functions on my main.js with the scope. Okay, so if we look at that, you can see that's what this looks like. And it's just a long list of data elements that I brought back from the backend database. And if I do a refresh here, actually went and fetched all the data and brought it back. If we look at the networking of this, so let's refresh this, and we come into user, my call to the database, you can see what it actually requested was my backend /rest/user, but it didn't put anything before this. And let me show you why it did not. So if we go back into my user factory here, you can see here this is how I define my user, or how I call my user resource. I did a query, and so that's one of the default items on query is a get and expecting an array back. The next section here is my query string. What I need to add is my query string. And so I did a empty string, so there's nothing in my query string. And then this is the callback functions for a user resource object. So what happens is since there's nothing in my query string, in this part of my object parameters was not satisfied, it just stripped out this part of my string. And I'll show in a minute here, it actually adding that stuff. So if I go into console, I actually printed out inside of my main.js the results of what I got back. And you can see here is actually a bunch of resource objects, and if I look into the objects, you can see here's my actual data. So I have my ID, I have a social security number or credit card number, city, country, email, first, last, and ID. And you can see here I also have, since this is a resource object, I have the proto of that resource. And if I open this up, you can see I actually do have my add, delete, get, query, remove, and save. Okay, so I'm actually getting back a resource object back from the back end. Now, one of the nice things about the user resource is here I'm doing a promise. So I do a defer queue, and then I return the promise, and then I actually here either reject or resolve my promise. I can, if I really wanted to, do a return user resource, my query, and then do a $promise like this, and that will return the promise out into whatever called it. And it's basically no different than the promise that I did here. I like doing it this way personally because if someone comes in behind me and updates this and changes this, I still know I'm going to return a promise. And so someone doesn't accidentally mess up a lot of code just because they changed this particular method. I know this is always returning a promise, and I need to satisfy that promise no matter what I'm doing in between the deferred and the return statement. Okay. So that's a pretty simple example of just fetching the data. But what it does for you is you can see I have all of these rows here. And if I click on a row, and I'm doing my edit here, what I've done here, and let's look at that call, is if I go into main.js, I have a open add user, or actually it's a edit user here. What I've done is I have opened the a modal that sits below it, and then I take this user. So one of the things about ng-repeat, if you don't remember from our previous discussions, is that the this on a method call on a ng-repeat is a scope item of that row. And so what I have here when I do a this is the actual scope of that row of that ng-repeat. And if you look at the HTML, you can see here I defined a new object inside of each scope item called user, and that is what I'm grabbing right here, as I'm grabbing that user object. And I'm passing this in and making it the selected user, and then I print it out. And so then if you look at my HTML again, my modal is down here, and inside of my modal, you can see I've got my ng modal mapped to the selected user dot first, selected user dot last to actually display that data. So here's my data. So I'm going to change the names here, and then I'm going to hit save. And what that save is this method call. So you can see down here at the bottom, I have two different saves. I have one for adding a user and one for saving the user. So we'll look at the save user. We go back into my main save user. All I've done here is I've made a call to that resource object and the $save. So all I'm doing is doing that post with the data that is already on that row object. I didn't have to create a query string for it. I didn't have to make a URL that maps all the save and then push the data into it. I just had to make a call to save. And then what I do here is I come back and I just, when it gets finished saving to the back end, I close down the modal and I make sure that the user select is updated. And so if we go back here and we look at John Doe, if we look at number 22, and we look at my database, you can see here now it says John Doe for the user first name and last name. Okay, so it makes the coding very clear. Now, one of the things you notice here is I actually made this call outside of the user factory. And I did that on purpose to show that this is a resource object that I'm passing around, that it's not something I'm doing inside of the user factory that's special. I just have this resource object and I called a save. Delete does exactly the same thing. So you can see here I'm telling it to delete the user, but this time I decided I wanted to do it proper and pass it back to the user factory. So we go into the user factory and look at delete. All I'm doing is I'm grabbing my parameter and calling $remove. So if we look at that, let's delete line 22 now. Let's see what's wrong here. This worked this morning. Huh. Oh, I know what happened. I changed the code a little bit this morning. It's causing this to bomb out now. But basically what it does is it calls the remove. If we look at the networking here, one of the things you notice is here's my update. Okay, and so on my update, you can see here what it did was it found this ID in my payload on my query string and replaced that colon user with that ID. And then inside of the body, it added the data that I had inside of my resource object to start off with, and then updated the back end. Yeah, I forgot to delete that. So that's what the basics of this. So let me show you any questions on that real quick before I move on to what makes it even cooler. Okay, so what makes it even cooler is this is basically the same example, but I'm doing pagination. So you can see here I'm going back and forth on my pagination. But one of the things I'm doing is this is fetching the data from the back end every single time. And so you look here, you can see all the calls that I'm making. And one of the things it's doing is adding this question mark limit 10 start 20. When we look at the code, I made a separate call here that says get user by page. And what that does is it's passing a limit and a start, and I created a query string this time that says limit and start, and I added it here into my query string. And so what happens is it will take this object, basically stringify it, and put it in as your query string. And so I didn't have to do anything special with my URL. I didn't have to add a question mark and a bunch of stuff after that. It actually just goes in, takes your query string, stringifies it, and then put it into your query string for you. If I put in here an ID, it would have underscore ID. It would use that underscore ID here if it could have. If it couldn't find it there, then what we'll do is look into the data on a save or data on a post and add it, use it if it can. The last thing I want to talk about is this. One of the things they did is they gave you the ability to add more functions onto the $resource. So here what I've done is I've actually added a new method called add, and it's using the put method instead of a get, post, or delete. And when we call it, you can see here on the add, all I did was just call that method, and it's just add. The values that you can put in here are the same values that you can put in with the config of HTTP. So you can see here's method. I can do URLs, parameters, and data, and transform request, transform response. So I have a little bit different example here. So here's a that's the database. Here we go. Nope. Oh, factory. Here's a little bit of example of a like department get. I'm making a get method with a URL with a little bit different URL than what I have in my default company resource, and then more parameters that I'm trying to map out. So you're able to extend your company resource and add more stuff to it as you need to add to it. So it makes it a little bit more useful than just doing strictly RESTful calls to the back end. The other thing that's nice is since this is actually just extending the $HTTP, that when you do unit testing, you'll still use the HTTP backend just as you would if you were doing a HTTP call, just normal $ HTTP. So all of the unit tests that you run would run exactly the same way. In fact, I have seen people replace HTTP with the resource, and the unit tests actually do not change a bit because the calls are exactly the same at that point. And then, and that's about it. So the main thing to know is that you have some functionality with $resource that you don't have with HTTP. It makes it very easy when you're dealing with RESTful calls that you don't have to create a URL for every single RESTful object that you're trying to create. That most of it is already there. Especially with you guys, since I don't think you're using any puts, it makes it very easy because you delete, your post, and your get are already defined. And it's just a matter of adding that resource into a factory and using it. Also, since you guys are using a lot of grids, you don't necessarily have to jump through a lot of hoops to edit and do inline editing of a row. Is because you already have that resource. All you have to do is save it every time you make a change, and it should save to the back end. Now, one of the downsides of doing some of that is if you have to do a rollback because something errored out on the back end and you can't just do a refresh, then it makes it a little bit more difficult because you have to do a clone or deep copy of that object, make the change to the back end, see if it changed. If it didn't, roll that change back, the saved data back into your data, and then throw an error message. Most of the time you don't see that. Most of the time it will just error out, and then you'll ask the user to refresh so you can start over again or try the save again to the back end. This is pretty common issues with AJAX calls anyways, so it's nothing that we haven't seen in the past or something that you don't have to kind of think about a little bit when you talk about error messaging. All right, so that's $resource. Like I said, this is going to be a little bit shorter than some of the other ones that I've done. Any questions about $resource?
I don't have any questions, but this is pretty good. I needed this. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, and all this is on, I actually put these two projects up on GitHub, so you can go into my GitHub, JC Dalton 2201, if you want to actually look at the code and play with it, download it and play with it. It is up on my GitHub.
Very cool. Okay, thanks.
Any questions from anyone else? All right, well, if there's no questions, then once again, if you guys have anything you need to want to talk about, anything you want me to go over, please email me, and we'll set up a WebEx for it. And it doesn't have to be just about Angular. It can be anything on web apps and components and all that kind of stuff. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jason. Talk to you soon.